At the end of the 6th season of Star Wars The Clone Wars, we got to see Yoda experience a series of revelations about where the Clone Wars were headed. Over the course of his adventures, Yoda learned of the impending Jedi Purge, the true nature of the battle with the Sith, and the failings of the Jedi as a whole. You would think that at least some of this would be worth telling the Jedi Council, and yet Yoda kept quiet about the whole affair. As far as we can tell, he didn't even try to bring the Order back onto the right path. But why was this? Why didn't he try to prevent the Order's fall? In this video, we're going to answer that question.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
Over the course of his spiritual journey, Yoda learned several crucial lessons that would come to guide his thinking in later years. On Dagobah, he learned that the Jedi Order itself was flawed, doomed to fall, and in fact, that it was already falling. From the Force priestesses, he learned that the Jedi Order had fallen from its ideals and had started to be dominated by dogma and unrealistic expectations. Lastly, on Korriban, he faced specters of the Sith and learned that the Jedi had forgotten the lesson of self-sacrifice. These lessons contain the key to why Yoda didn't tell the Council about his visions. There was also a practical reason which we should touch on briefly. Essentially, there was no telling whether or not the Council would actually have believed him. After all, they were skeptical of his reports that Qui-Gon was speaking to him, and they literally placed him under house arrest over it. It's rather unreasonable to expect the Jedi Council to do a 180 and accept everything Yoda says unquestioningly. Making a full report would have been a lost cause, something Yoda knew well. But back to the lessons of Yoda's epiphanies. One of the major lessons of Yoda's journey was that the Jedi Order was flawed, that it had failed to properly champion the cause of light. Worse, these flaws had become entrenched in the structure of the Order, especially in the Council. This was hardly a groundbreaking revelation for most of us, of course, but it was something Yoda himself had failed to see for a long time. To quote Count Dooku, "The Jedi Order's problem is Yoda. No being can wield that kind of power for centuries without becoming complacent at best and corrupt at worst. He has no idea that it's overtaken him. He can no longer see that all the little cumulative evils that the Republic tolerates and fosters, from slavery to endless wars, and he never asks, why are we not acting to stop this? Live alongside corruption for too long, and you no longer notice the stench. The Jedi cannot help the slaves of Tatooine, but they can help the slave masters." Dooku was spot on with these criticisms, and they didn't just apply to Yoda, but the whole Jedi Order. In the centuries since the 7th Battle of Ruusan, the Jedi had slipped. They had become far too focused on protecting and serving the Republic, a thoroughly corrupt government guilty of all manner of terrible crimes, instead of serving the Force and the greater galaxy. They no longer heard the will of the Force, and in their myopic devotion to the Republic, they indirectly contributed to the rising power of the dark side. The Clone Wars were the perfect example of this. We've made many videos discussing the extent of the crimes committed by the Republic during the war, and how many of the Separatists had valid qualms with Coruscant. But despite this, the Jedi continued to fight for the Republic. They became so focused on winning the war that they couldn't even see they had begun to serve an empire. The Jedi had ceased to be the defenders of the balance, the guardians of peace and justice, the self-sacrificing saviors of the weak and defenseless. They had become generals instead, well-meaning generals in service to an abhorrent monster of a government. In trying to stop the Sith, the Jedi had unknowingly committed themselves to their service. Which brings us to another of Yoda's lessons, that the Sith had changed. For 1,000 years, the Jedi Order had been preparing for a rematch of the Sith Wars, for an epic clash between the armies of light and the armies of darkness. This was why the Jedi became so focused on winning the Clone Wars. They believed that the rematch was upon them, that the Confederacy was a new Brotherhood of Darkness, and that the clones were a new army of light to lead against them. It was a case of confirmation bias. The Sith presented what the Jedi expected to see, and so the Jedi accepted it almost without question. But as Yoda learned this was a trap, the Sith weren't playing by the same rules the Jedi were. They were waging a different kind of war, one of treachery and deceit. They had spent a millennium laying traps, and with the Clone Wars, they drew the Jedi right into them. Consider the series of events that led up to the Battle of Geonosis. While on a routine investigation mission, Obi-Wan Kenobi made several crucial discoveries. Kaminoans had made a clone army for the Jedi Order, that Count Dooku was rallying powerful corporations to the Separatist cause, and that the Geonosians were building a droid army for the Confederacy. Then, Kenobi, together with Anakin Skywalker and Padme Amidala, was captured, and all three were sentenced to death, which was tantamount to a Separatist declaration of war. The Jedi had two choices: to bury their heads in the sand and pretend that none of this was happening, or attempt to stop the coming war before it began. That choice was no choice at all, nor was the choice to fight a battle alone or accept the clone army waiting for them. Because of how the Sith had set things up, the Jedi had no choice but to fight the first Battle of Geonosis, kick-starting the Clone Wars, and once the Clone Wars were underway, there was no turning back. If they had tried to scale back their involvement in the Clone Wars, the Republic would have been defeated, and they likely would have been branded traitors and faced a purge a few years early. The Sith had set up a scenario in which they were guaranteed a victory no matter what. There was nothing the Jedi could have done to avoid their fate. This brings us back to the very first lesson Yoda learned on his journey. After his vision of the Jedi Purge, Yoda asked when it all would happen, and the Force, through the voice of Qui-Gon Jinn, said that it was already happening and had always been happening. The Sith had made the fall of the Jedi Order inevitable, but this actually would have been the case even if the Sith hadn't interfered. The systemic flaws in the Order that we discussed earlier would have caused the Order to fall on its own. The lesson of Yoda's vision in the future wasn't that the Jedi were going to fall, but that they had already fallen, and they had been destroying themselves ever since. Even before the Clone Wars, the destruction of the Jedi Order had already been happening. There was another lesson within this one. The Jedi Order had to be destroyed. Its flaws had become too great for reformation, and the whole institution ultimately needed to burn and be rebuilt if it was to serve the Force properly. This actually wasn't the first time this had been the case for the Jedi Order either. 4,000 years before the Clone Wars, the Jedi Order had been in a similar state. The Council had become myopic and dogmatic, and the Order was beginning to fail as a result. Fearing the return of the Sith, it failed to intervene in the Mandalorian Wars, resulting in a group of Jedi breaking off and fighting anyway. After the Mandalorians were defeated, those Jedi became Sith and turned on the Republic, and they were stopped only because of the redemption of one of their own. Even after the war was won, a new band of Sith rose up and began preying on the remaining Jedi, fighting a new sort of war that the Jedi weren't prepared for, and killing nearly all who remained. But still, the last of the Jedi Masters refused to accept their failures. They maintained that their decisions had been right and blamed everything on their fallen students. Some Star Wars fans have interpreted these sorts of failings as cases in which the Jedi became too extreme in their pursuit of the light, but the truth was actually the opposite. This arrogance and dogmatism had led the Jedi away from the path of the light. The Masters had focused on what they thought needed to be done instead of what the Force needed done. They rejected the lessons of the Force and tried to teach them. One of them, Jedi Master Atris, did this to such an extent that she actually fell fully into the grip of the dark side. In her hatred of the darkness and her arrogant, dogmatic pursuit of what she thought was the Jedi way, she had all but become Sith. In the end, the only solution to this problem was destroying what was left of the Jedi Order. Atris's fall was exposed and her teachings were prevented from infecting any future Jedi, while the rest of the Council was killed by Kreia for their failure to see the error of their ways. When all was said and done, the Jedi Order was built anew, built by those who could see the errors of their forebears and correct them. 4,000 years later, as the Clone Wars hurtled toward a fiery conclusion, the same thing needed to happen again. This is why Yoda didn't tell the Jedi Council about his experiences. He didn't understand all of what the Force had shown him. His revelation wouldn't come until his battle with Darth Sidious at the end of the war. But he understood enough to see that there was nothing that could be done. The Order was going to fall not because of some external force, but because of its own failings. failings that couldn't be reformed in any way. Couldn't avoid its date with destiny because it was already doomed, and the Sith had given them no choice. Most importantly of all, in the ways that mattered, the Jedi Order had already fallen, and now it needed to be destroyed. Even if the Council could have been convinced of all of this, it would have changed nothing. Yoda likely didn't expect the destruction of the Jedi Order to be as complete as it ended up being. He likely expected it would be a second round of the Dark Wars, in which the Jedi vanished for a few years and then rebuilt themselves like nothing happened. But he did understand that the details didn't matter. The damage had already been done. Nothing exemplifies this better than the question Mace Windu asked shortly after Yoda's return.
Did your journey give you insight on how to win the war?
If Yoda wasn't already resolved to let things play out as the Force willed, this question surely would have convinced him to. He had just pursued the voice of a dead Jedi across the galaxy, looking for answers to deep questions about the Force and the Order's place in the universe, and still the Council's focus was on tactical victory in the Clone Wars. Yoda maintained hope that the light would triumph in the end, but in that moment, he knew it wasn't going to come through the Jedi Order. The Order had already fallen. All Yoda could do was try make sure that there would be a foundation to rebuild on. So that's why Yoda didn't tell the Jedi Council all the juicy details of his bad ketamine trip at the end of Season 6. But what do you think? Have you considered this angle before? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below. And guys, if you're itching for some more content, make sure you check out our new channel where we post very high quality videos. We take a look at some of the most badass people from all different eras of history. So if that sounds like it tickles your fancy, that's the first link in the description below. If you're more of a musical type bloke, we also have our Relax Jack music channel where we use a lot of the stuff posted there on the channel here. So if you like the background music we use, make sure you check out that channel. And if you want access to a behind the scenes Discord where you can chat to myself and the team who work with me, make sure you consider donating there. And if you just want access to the wider Geetsly's community, check us out on our main Geetsly's Discord and our Geetsly's gaming network. Anyways guys, as always, thank you so much for watching and I hope to see you in the next video.